Hey, how's it going everybody? It's Mr. White here with your post-classical Southwest Asia and Africa test review. So you need to have your test review out and in front of you. If you don't have it, you can download it from my website. Just check the web address on your screen. You also want to have a piece of notebook paper so that you can write this information down, because you will need to study this information. If you don't study this, if you just watch the video, it's not going to help you very much. So without further ado, we're going to get right into this thing, and I'm going to talk really fast because some of y'all say my test reviews are too long. So I'm going to try to speed this thing up for you. First off, it talks about Islam. Where did it begin? Islam began in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula is shown here on this map, and you want to pay close attention to this because you're going to have to recognize it on a map like this for the test. The Arabian Peninsula is also called the Middle East. It's part of Asia. It's Southwest Asia, hence the name of this test review. So make sure that you can recognize this on a map. Next up, Sunni versus Shia. Now, Sunni and Shia are the two different sects of Islam. Keep in mind I said S-E-C-T-S, sects, which means the two different branches of Islam. They split over the question of who should be Muhammad's legitimate successor. Legitimate successor was called the Caliph. Remember that from our video about the Golden Age of Islam. They still argue over this issue today. Remember that the Shia believed that only a male descendant of Muhammad could be the Caliph. The Sunnis believed it should be the most virtuous member of the Muslim community, meaning basically the best Muslim. Alright, next up, the 5 pillars of Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam are the 5 most important things that every Muslim is supposed to do in their life. First off is faith. They have to believe that there is only one God. We call that monotheism. And they have to believe that this one God had a final prophet named Muhammad. The second pillar is prayer. Muslims all have to pray 5 times a day at specific times of the day. And every Muslim, when they pray, faces the holy city of Mecca. Mecca is the most important city for Muslims. That was where the Prophet Muhammad lived, and it is also the location of the Kaaba. Remember that big black cube? Now, next up is fasting. Every Muslim is supposed to fast during the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is a month in the Islamic lunar calendar. You may remember that's why they have a crescent moon as the symbol of their religion. During Ramadan, Muslims do not eat from sunrise to sunset. It's a very important tradition. Next up is charity. For some religions, charity is a suggestion. For Muslims, it's a requirement. Every single Muslim, whether rich or poor, is expected to give to the less fortunate. And last of all is what's known as pilgrimage. Muslims call it the Hajj. That's when they make a journey at least once in their life to the holy city of Mecca. So please remember the 5 pillars of Islam. That's going to be a very important part of the test. Next up, treatment of Jews and Christians. You may remember that Jews and Christians were the people of the book, along with Muslims. They all have a very similar monotheistic tradition that goes all the way back to the Prophet Abraham. So the answer to this one is, how did Jews and Christians get treated? With tolerance. As a matter of fact, during this time, Jews and Christians lived freely with Muslims in the Caliphate. However, they were subjected to higher taxes. Remember, they had to pay sort of a poll tax. And this was something that actually motivated a lot of Jews and Christians to convert to Islam during this time, because it made things financially better for them. It was cheaper to be a Muslim. Now, next up is, it says geographic images. It should say geometric images. Go ahead and scratch that out on your test review and fix that. Geographic, it should say geometric. Geometric images were important because they were mathematical. And you may remember that mathematics are sort of like a form of divine wisdom according to Muslims. They also use calligraphy, which is fancy writing, and generally the writing comes from verses from the Quran. So if you look very closely at many mosques and other Islamic buildings, they will contain these verses from the Quran written in beautiful language called calligraphy. And the whole purpose of this was that Muslims did not want to create images of people or animals for the most part, because they believed that that could lead to idolatry. Idolatry is worshiping images instead of worshiping God. And so, because of the fact that Muhammad did not want to be worshipped, that was part of why he forbid his followers from drawing pictures of him or making statues of him. And that's why even to this day, Muslims do not draw pictures or make any kind of image of the Prophet Muhammad or Allah. It's just not something they do. Now, next up, Bedouins. The Bedouins were nomadic pastoralists. That means people who move around a lot and raise animals. They lived in the deserts of Arabia. So that's the really important fact to remember about the Bedouins. They were desert-dwelling people. Well, it's not a number, whatever. Next up, spread of Islam. Now, Islam spread very rapidly out of its original location in the Arabian Peninsula of the Middle East. The first places it went were into Persia and North Africa. Then eventually it spread all the way into Europe and into some parts of West Africa. Eventually it got all the way to India and Central Asia and even a little bit into Southeast Asia. Now, for the way that it spread, it was different. You know, in places like West Africa and some parts of the Middle East, especially in Southeast Asia, Islam was spread by Islamic merchants who actually moved to those parts of the world and established families that had Islamic traditions. This was also the case in East Africa. However, in Europe and some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, Islam was spread by military conquests. You may remember we talked about those early caliphs who went out and spread the Islamic faith by any means necessary. Now, the golden age of Islam was that time period under the Umayyads and the Abbasids. That was something that we talked about in my last video lecture. So for the golden age of Islam, you need to know that there were lots of great advancements in science and mathematics. For example, remember that Islamic doctors were the first ones to understand how the human heart functions. Now, this was made possible by Muslim control over important trade routes, kind of like the Silk Road. Remember, that was an important trade route. And they also controlled the Indian Ocean trade and the gold salt trade in North Africa. So the caliphate became very wealthy and very diverse, and they encouraged learning and they encouraged new people to come in and bring new ideas. And that's what led to this flourishing of art and science and math that we call the Islamic Golden Age. Next up is the Umayyads. That's how you say that, Umayyads. They favored Arab Muslims over non-Arab Muslims. However, that was not something that helped people to convert to the religion. The reason why the Umayyads were successful in spreading Islam was because they were clever. They gave financial incentives. Remember I said that people who were not Muslim had to pay higher taxes. So under the Umayyads, if you converted to Islam, your taxes went down. And we know that everybody hates taxes, so that was actually a very successful way for the Umayyads to get people to convert to Islam. Now, next up, it asks about Baghdad. Baghdad is still an important city in the world, but in the Golden Age of Islam, it was the greatest city in the world. It was magnificent. As a matter of fact, it became so great because it was right smack dead in the middle of many major trade routes. So all kinds of new people were coming in with new ideas. The architecture was outstanding, and all of the money and all of the trade and all of the new ideas led to a flourishing of culture and many different scientific achievements, especially in the area of medicine. All right, next up, West Africa. Islam spread to West Africa because of the gold salt trade. You may remember I said that those Islamic merchants moved into places like Ghana and eventually Mali and Songhai, and once they got there, they established Muslim families, and these traditions naturally spread throughout families in West Africa. And speaking of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, you may remember those were the three great African kingdoms that we studied about. They were all influenced by Islam because of their interaction with the gold salt trade. Those Arab merchants came all the way across the Sahara, and once they got to these places, they spread their beliefs to the people who lived in West Africa. Now, one of those people who lived in West Africa was the next guy on our list, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a king of Mali during the 13th century, the 14th century, got a little mixed up there. And he was the first African to make the Hajj to Mecca. Hajj, you may remember, is one of those pillars of Islam. It's the pilgrimage. So he went to Mecca and he sort of put Mali on the map. And all along the way, he was very generous. Remember, charity is one of those pillars of Islam. He gave away lots of gold, and so he made himself very popular along the way there. As you might imagine, if somebody's giving out free money, they're a pretty popular dude. And he also helped to convert many people to Islam. And this led to Islamic learning and the growth of Islamic culture all over West Africa. You know, when Mansa Musa came back from his Hajj, he brought lots of Islamic scholars and also lots of Islamic artists with him to improve his hometown of Timbuktu. And we'll be talking more about Timbuktu because The next thing on our list is the gold salt trade. So gold salt trade is exactly what it sounds like. People were trading gold and salt for many other products that came from all around the world across the Sahara Desert. That's why it's also known as the Trans-Saharan trade. Now, it wasn't just products that were moving across the desert, ideas were moving across the desert too. For example, Islam. I know we've talked about this before, but you see this pattern going here, right guys? This whole test is about Islam, so most of the stuff, if it's asking, it's going to be asking about Islam. It made Ghana, Mali, and Songhai very rich, and cities like Timbuktu, which is located in Mali, became geographically important because they lie right in the middle of these trade routes. Sort of like how the city of Baghdad was right in the middle of trade routes, and it made Baghdad very successful. The geographic location of Timbuktu also made it very successful. Now next up, the Great Mosque of Djenne. That's how you say that. I know it looks like Djenne, but it's Djenne.
Djenne, 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 Djenne!
Okay. Now, this is what the Great Mosque of Djenne looks like. It's a fantastic example of how Islamic architecture adapted to local conditions and cultures in West Africa. So everywhere you go in the world you see mosques, but the mosques are different based on the kind of building materials they have and also based on other geographic concerns like the climate and honestly even the income level of the place. Now, this Great Mosque of Djenne is a really beautiful example of Islamic architecture, and it's very distinct because it reflects the culture of the place where it was built. Next up, Swahili. Swahili came from East Africa. It's actually one of the main language and cultural groups of that part of the world, and it was created by the centuries-long interaction of Arab Muslim traders and African merchants. Over time, these Arab Muslim traders and the African merchants mixed together. Some of them created families together, and their languages combined with other languages like Portuguese to create a unique new language group in East Africa. That language today is called Swahili. Alright, next up is the Mughal Empire. That's how you say that, Mughal. They were the Islamic Empire in northern India, one of the greatest Islamic empires in northern India. And they are very famous for having built this, the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal was actually a burial chamber for Shah Jahan's wife. Now it's the most famous building in India, and it's probably the most famous example of Islamic architecture in the world. It's something that when we think of mosques, we tend to think of a building that looks sort of like Taj Mahal. Next up, talks about trade. Trade was something that led to a rise of powerful cities all over the world. We've already talked about a few like Baghdad and Timbuktu, but there are many others like Cairo in Egypt and Peking in China, and even Venice in Italy. These cities all became rich and powerful because they happened to be in a good geographic location where they could take advantage of major trade routes. Alright, so that's it for our post-classical Southwest Asia and Africa part of the test. Now let's talk about the test review questions. And I know you're saying, wait a minute, Mr. White, this is the test review. What I mean is the test questions that come from previous tests. These are some questions that some of you had trouble with, so let's make sure that we all understand what the answers are so that nobody misses these on the test on Friday. Okay, first thing is scar. Guys, remember that scar is something that refers to the characteristics of civilization, not the Neolithic Revolution. See, the Neolithic Revolution is what caused scar to happen. If it wasn't for the invention of farming, aka the Neolithic Revolution, we wouldn't have civilizations in the first place. So things like specialization of labor, complex institutions, advanced cities and technology, and record keeping were made possible by the Neolithic Revolution. But remember that those things are the characteristics of civilization. Okay, next up, the geography of Greece. I don't know how many times we have to go over this, but let's go over it again. Remember that Greece is full of mountains and it also has lots of little islands. These are geographic barriers that separated people. And since the people were separated geographically, they were also separated politically. Remember, they divided themselves into these little independent city-states. And that was something that was a result of the geography of Greece. Next up, it talks about the Zhou dynasty. I know it looks like Zhao, but it's Zhou. And the Zhou dynasty ruled their kingdom through feudalism. Feudalism is a system where lords trade land for loyalty. Lots of L's involved there. I realize that. Now, what happened was many of these lords under the Zhou dynasty became so powerful that they raised their own armies and they started fighting with each other. And eventually all this chaos led people to believe that the Zhou dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. Hopefully everybody remembers the mandate of heaven. That was one of those main things we learned about China. Next up, it wants to know about Ashoka. Ashoka Mauryan was one of the greatest kings of India, and he was known for spreading Buddhism all throughout Asia. Remember, he sent those missionaries to China. That's how Buddhism got there. He also built lots of infrastructure. In case you forgot, infrastructure means like roads and bridges and even hospitals. He was also somebody who was known for building rock pillar edicts, which were basically like these big pillars that were inscribed with Buddhist teachings so that he could spread his message of Buddhism all over India. All right, and last but certainly not least, Confucianism. Confucianism was one of those philosophies that came from China. It was created by a guy called Kung Fu Si, also known as Confucius to us Europeans. And he was somebody who believed very strongly in ideas like filial piety, also respect for your elders, ancestor worship, following traditions. And so that was why many Chinese dynasties chose to hire well-educated men to serve in the government bureaucracy. And the way that they would choose those well-educated men was through a civil service exam. Remember, we said it was like a standardized test. Of course, since this standardized test relied very heavily on being able to read and write well, it was generally the people who had access to education in reading and writing that passed the test. Most of those people were rich, and so that led to a new class of rulers in China that were from the wealthy, educated class, and we called those people scholar gentry. Remember, scholar gentry simply means educated, rich person. Okay, so that is it. We've gone over the entire test review. Can you believe it? That was pretty fast. Okay, now you'll notice that down at the bottom, we forgot to put those essay prompts in there. Sorry, guys. Make sure you check with your teacher and get the essay prompts, and make sure that you pre-plan your essay. If you come to class and you don't know anything about any of these essay prompts, it's not going to be a fun day for you. But if you plan ahead, the essays are not that bad, and I'm sure that you'll get a full 10 points on that essay section. Okay, guys, that's the end of the test review. I don't want to waste any more of your time, so please make sure you study. Don't come into the test unprepared. Good luck, and I'll see you next time.